Last one, who is Ben Recht? And today, Ben Recht is a computer science professor at the University of California, Berkeley. He's known for his work in machine learning, optimization, and control theory. Ben's research, actually, Recht's more respectful. Research focuses on developing algorithms that can learn from data and make decisions in real-world scenarios. He has also made contribution to the field of compressed sensing, a signal processing technique for acquiring and reconstructing signals that are sparse or compressible. Recht has received numerous awards for his research, including a presidential early career award for scientists and a PICAS in 2012. I think he had more, and even fancier. But I was not super satisfied, so I actually asked him, is he any good? And he says, as a language model, I cannot provide a personal opinion on individuals of good work. However, Ben Recht is widely regarded as an accomplished computer science professor and researcher. He has made significant contribution to fields of machine learning, optimization, and control theory. He worked and studied extensively, and he received numerous awards that I mentioned here. I don't know if you haven't tried ChatGPT, but the problem I have is that I'm impatient. This is too long. I forgot what he said, so I asked him, yes or no? And he says, as an AI language model, I'm designed to provide factual information. I cannot give opinions or make subjective judgments. My responses are based on publicly available information and not influenced by personal biases. Therefore, I cannot give a simple yes or no answer. At this point, we stop reading. I think the question is open, so hopefully we can all judge ourselves.
Well, Lorenzo, how many layers do I have?
I don't know. I'll ask.
Let me know at the end. Okay. All right. Well, I think technology is working, and if it's not, it's part of the course. That's fine. We'll ask ChatGPT how to use Microsoft Teams. I'm sure that will be exciting for all of us. Yeah. So, okay. Sorry, I have to get in the headspace. I'm trying to put this together. I lost all of my Chrome tabs. I'm having a little crisis up here now. There was some serious stuff on there, including a New Yorker article I've been meaning to read, and then no, whatever. Anyway, it'll be fine. Actually, what I did lose there was I've been using Chrome tabs to keep track of a bunch of things I haven't filed into Zotero for this new project I'm trying to do. This is part of this new project. It's been longer than that, but the last year I've been indulging a academic midlife crisis where I've been not sure what I want to do with my life more generally, but certainly my academic life. And I guess part of that was I got a little bit stuck on what would be the right thing to do in machine learning. So I kind of just stopped thinking about machine learning and tried to figure out how we got here in the first place. So I've been, better for worse, trying to assemble a bit of a history of the different parts of machine learning and different parts of statistics, different things that influence what we now know as machine learning. And one thing that I came back to many times is trying to understand some of our notions of statistical thinking and kind of their history and trajectory. So today, we're going to talk about cancer screening and use cancer screening as a lens into more general problems of prediction. But it's actually a fascinating topic in its own right to understand where the idea of preventative medicine arose and how we became convinced that it was actually worthwhile. So, moreover, many people have been thinking about using machine learning in healthcare settings. There's a whole conference which I attended in December on machine learning for health. And there's a survey paper that was in a Nature journal, Digital Medicine, that tried to lay the field out here. It had a bunch of notable people from Google and Eric Topol and big thought leaders on data-driven healthcare. And they split machine learning for health into two groups. The first group is on automating unstructured data into diagnostics, prognostics, clinical predictions, and combinations thereof. So somehow the ChatGPT is doctor. The second bucket was using a generative model to reconstruct things that are physiological, which after reading through the lines, it was very clear what they meant was medical imaging. So two sides of the coin for machine learning. Medical imaging, and we have this more out there thing about using diagnostics, using big data to come up with diagnostics and treatment plans for people. Now, most of the papers in the machine learning for health space are on A, this predictions part. However, I think most of the successful applications that are currently deployed that everyone uses are in B. And I guess the question is, why is it that A hasn't caught on? Why is it just not enough time? Is it just that we need GPT-7 instead of GPT-4? What exactly do we need to make these data-driven tools work? I think one of the critical questions that not enough people ask is fundamentally what A is after, what this first bullet is after, are creating predictions from medical data. But the role of the prediction in medical data is not cut and dry. I think actually in most machine learning, it's not a given that we know what to do when we take a prediction and then use it for something. We know how to build predictions. We have a whole theory of this. How do we use them? Please come. So what I'm going to focus on today is mammography, which has been a huge test case for machine learning methods. And this paper was written by people at Google Health and Google DeepMind. And what they claim is that their AI that they generated has better area under the curve than humans for breast cancer diagnoses. Now, the first question I asked when I read this paper was, what is the area under the curve of a doctor? Or really of any individual? I'm not sure if anyone's ever thought of that. Doctors, we don't have a parameter that we vary. I'm not sure that people have parameters that they vary to get you a trade-off between sensitivity and specificity. They have a point in sensitivity, specificity space. And so how you try to figure out exactly what the curve is always very confusing. And I'm not quite sure I buy this, what these folks were selling. I think the interesting part of this is that trying to claim that computers are better than people at diagnosing cancer has a much longer history than just in the recent ML hype. So this is a paper from 1993 claiming that artificial neural networks applied to imaging, here is the machine they were using in 1993, could actually outperform physicians. But again, it didn't catch on then, and it didn't catch on now. And perhaps the question there is like, what exactly are you trying to accomplish when you look at a mammogram? And what is the actual end goal of requesting that healthy women have a mammography screen? What is the end goal that you're trying to do with that screen? What are you trying to predict in the first place? So to do that, I want to take us on a bit of a tour of what exactly happens in mammography screening. And I'll explain this graphic along the way, which you could tell it's the 1970s illustration here. So we're going to go a little bit deeper into the history of mammography. I want to describe why it seems so initially promising. However, what we're going to see, and I think most people are aware at this stage, but I'll take you through it. The promise of mammography is much less today than it was in the 70s. And I think, if anything, we're becoming more likely to not do them than to do them for a broad population. I'm going to kind of discuss how we started to see that the screening was not delivering on its promise, and how this actually is a story about something a little bit even broader in cancer screening, and try to draw into question, because we focus so hard on predictions, perhaps we're not actually improving people's lives with that prediction-centered focus. So the thing that I want to tie back to machine learning, and the things that you probably already know as machine learning researchers, or I hope you know as machine learning researchers, is that labels, whatever a label is in medicine, is a very murky notion. What exactly we mean by cancer specifically, or or any other diagnosis, can be very murky. We also have to appreciate that populations change over time. And if we have a treatment that we believe works for one population, we have to always investigate whether it's going to work for what looks to be the same population 10 years or 20 years later. And I think the most important thing is that predictions themselves are not an intervention. Just because you're able to predict some outcome doesn't mean you are able to change it. And we're going to So keep those three in mind. We'll come back to them at the end. All right, so what is the promise of cancer screening? The idea is, as most of us know, cancers that are that cause life-threatening illness are a potentially normal cell, or what appears to be normal tissue, that turns into very non-normal tissue that grows very rapidly. And when it grows very rapidly, it pushes out the way for healthy tissue and can eventually lead to death. And we know that the growth rate can be quite rapid and aggressive. And our opportunity to actually intervene and perhaps cure or at least stem the growth of cancer usually happens before you want to try to get at the cancer before it is grown out of control. Right? So you want to get it at an early stage, but at least again, the working hypothesis here. At this slide, I'm not vouching for it. I'm just trying to describe what the promise of screening is. The problem with things before screening is that people would present symptoms far too late. By the time you have symptoms, probably the cancer is of a quite large size, and it may be your window to operate might be very, very thin. So the promise of screening is that perhaps it's detectable really early, and at this stage the cancer would be very small, in which case you can remove it or perhaps give chemotherapy and then not have to worry about it later. Right? So the hypothesis is that if you could predict cancer before the symptoms, then whatever interventions we have at our disposal for treating cancer will be more effective. That's the working hypothesis. And this was the hypothesis of Philip Strax, who wrote the book with this, the illustration I've been using in 1972. And it's quite an audacious title, that breast cancer is curable. So this was written 50 years ago. So Strax was a radiologist, and his wife tragically died of breast cancer at the age of 39. And this kind of radicalized Strax to say, I have to use everything at my disposal to cure cancer. In the late 50s, a very repeatable method to do X-ray screening of breast tissue, which we now know as mammography, was developed by Dr. Egan. And Strax read this paper, thought this was really compelling, and thought, well, what if we could just do this for everyone who comes into the clinic? Perhaps we could find cancers and then try to do those surgeries early. So Strax's advocacy and a key clinical trial led to mammography being a very niche kind of intervention into, at least in the late 90s, every woman over 40 was recommended to get them almost either annually or semi-annually. So it became a real mainstream procedure. So what was that evidence that went from this one niche idea by Egan to something that actually became like the standard of care, at least in the United States? We're going to go through it. The main evidence, this is where we tie ourselves back into computer science, was something called the randomized controlled clinical trial. Interestingly, the randomized controlled clinical trial is also a very recent phenomenon. The first one was in 1947, and I'll come back to it. I think it's one now that hopefully all of us have at least seen in a statistics class. I'll go through the basis of it. The main idea is that we have two treatments, A and B. I want to know, is A or B better to treat the particular disease before me? And what we do is we split patients into two groups. Everybody in one group gets treatment A, everybody in the other group gets treatment B, and then we compare how they do. The initial clinical trials of the 40s and the late 30s used an alternating procedure where every patient was either in A or B, depending on when they showed up to the hospital. But there was a problem here that was pointed out by Bradford Hill, who's a really important statistician, arguably the most important applied statistician of the 20th century. And what he noted is that if a doctor is going to pretty quickly be able to figure out if a patient is getting the treatment or not, or getting A or B. And once they do that, they know every assignment. Once you figure out one person, you know every assignment if you're doing alternating. So in order to keep the doctors blinded, to make sure the doctors didn't know who was getting what, now you would give the patients a random assignment that was not known to the doctor, that was not known to the patient, and you would try to observe the outcome with as few biases as possible and make a comparison that way. And so the randomized controlled clinical trial was a revolutionary idea because all sorts of problems that might creep into a medical study, or many of the problems that would creep into a medical study, could be at least mitigated. So you could, it was a way to blind both the patients and the caregivers to who was receiving treatment. It creates a common starting point. The time that a patient is randomized now becomes the time that we start to observe whether or not the treatment works or not. Randomization removes confounding because the only way that a person ends up with a treatment is if they are assigned at random. Whereas perhaps if they had a connection, they could get themselves into another group in the earlier time. Right? So this is removing all sorts of confounding biases that might explain why a particular person's in one group or the other. And for us stats folks, what's funny is that when we learned this as statisticians, we learned this one first. Turns out it's like the least important thing. But the reason why Fisher was interested in randomized experiments was to estimate the effect, the size and the magnitude of the effect of the treatment. And actually, I'll just have a little taste of that stats right now because I figured I'm coming to a stats ML group. I'll give you one slide of statistics and then we'll go back to history. So I think that the mathematics of the randomized trial is beautiful and really simple. I always want to kind of just highlight why it's so simple and it makes it so much nicer than almost all other statistics. Is because since the experimenter is doing the randomness, we can get very clean results as to what we are seeing and whether we're seeing is a statistical artifact or not. Let's take trials out of your head for a second. And let's just think about this silly problem. If I have the problem that maybe we teach in early probability, where I have an urn and that urn has red and blue balls in it, and I randomly select half of the balls out of the urn. I count up the number of red ones and I look at the proportion. So I see I took n/2 of the balls out of the urn, and so there were m red ones. What's my estimate for the proportion k/n? So the true proportion is k/n. I pulled n/2 balls and saw m. What would be my, oh, I realized I just messed something up, but that's okay. See in a second. I see a typo on my next slide, so you guys can correct me why I'm wrong. I love that keynote. It's telling me that I have a typo. Thank you. Lorenzo, what would you estimate I don't actually see all the balls. I can't actually tell you it's k/n. I saw m red ones, and I have n/2 of them. What is a good estimate for the proportion? Yeah, there we go. So there should be 2. Should be a 2. I'll go back and correct that. But everybody gets what I'm saying here. It's 2m/n, right? You just look at the proportion that you see. So it's kind of so I apologize to everybody. Hopefully everyone sees where the error is. I took n/2, so it should be 2m/n. But regardless, the idea here is that if I can get an unbiased estimate of the total number by sampling half, and that's what's happening in a randomized trial. You can think of it, I have two virtual urns. The urn when everybody gets the treatment and the urn when everybody doesn't get the treatment. And so if I sample half from one of the urns and half from the other of the urns, I can get an unbiased estimate of the proportion of bad outcomes under treatment and proportion of bad outcomes during treatment. So if in the control group, or let's say the group A, the rate of bad events is CER, and under treatment, the rate of bad events is TER, I can estimate the average treatment effect, which is just the proportion of the time that a bad outcome occurs in the control group versus the treatment group by just counting them up and getting the differences. And perhaps more importantly, but the thing that everybody in applied stats will argue about for days is that you could say with some probability of my sampling, the true average treatment effect is in an interval where I have the estimated average treatment effect plus a variance correction term and minus that same variance correction term. And this is called a confidence interval. And if you're so lucky that 0 is not in the confidence interval, your result is called statistically significant, at least at the 0.05 level, and you get your Nature paper. And if it's not, maybe you like find a different tool in R, change this number until it is 0.05. Okay. The games we play. Okay, so there's the statistics behind it. We'll see these numbers with these control event rates and treatment event rates in a minute. So when I'm talking about confidence intervals, I'm always talking about them in this very simple sense. So randomized trials caught on very quickly. The first randomized trial was using an antibiotic to treat tuberculosis in 1947. Bradford Hill was the key statistician involved here. And what they saw was there were 4 deaths out of the 55 people who were being treated with streptomycin, and 15 deaths out of the people who were just given bed rest alone. So in this case, the average treatment effect is about 22%. So that the benefit, the risk reduction between the two groups is about 22%. That's a big number. That's a big number. Antibiotics are one of the few things where that actually works. Like there's one that's just a miracle of the 20th century. The second, and probably one of the most famous randomized trials, was the Salk vaccine trial to prevent paralysis by polio. This was done in the United States in 1954. This one's a little trickier because there were only 115 cases in the control group of paralysis out of 200,000 children, which is rare. I mean, it's devastating if that's your child. It's one of those 115. But overall, paralysis by polio was very rare. However, so there's 115 cases in the control group, 33 cases in the treatment group. The rate of reduction, the relative reduction, is 3.5. And that seems big. You're saying that if I take the vaccine, I'm reducing my risk by a factor of 4. So here we have a difference, right? The absolute risk. Here we have a relative risk, depending on how you want. Now, some people like to think that relative risk is almost like overstating your case, but for a really tragic event with children, perhaps that's really something we care about. So for rare events, you always tend to see results given in relative risk because the absolute risk is so small. All right, so now we turn to breast cancer. How do we take the same idea and apply it to breast cancer? And I just want to bring these two here to note that we're getting into cases that are more and more murky. In one case, we have very sick people with tuberculosis, and we treat them with a drug. In the second case, we have healthy children that we vaccinate, and then we try to observe whether or not they develop a bad condition. Here, in cancer screening, we're going to take healthy women, otherwise healthy women, now not give them a treatment, but just try to see if we can find evidence that they might later become sick and do an intervention. So we're getting more and more indirect as we work our way from 1947 to 1961. So the big, I do find it fascinating, however, that the difference between when we first started doing randomized trials as a medical practice and to when we were doing cancer screening is 15 years. That's so really rapidly caught on as a great idea for determining how effective interventions were. So this study was planned in 1961. The enrollment started in 1963, and the enrollment ended in 1966. It was women who had their health insurance through this particular plan in New York. 31,000 were offered mammograms. 31,000 were just given usual care. The ones that were offered the mammograms were offered follow-ups. So if they accepted the mammogram one year, they were offered an annual follow-up the next year. If they accepted that one, they were offered a third. And as you might imagine, the number who said yes in the treatment group shrunk over time. So not people, I mean, mammograms aren't pleasant. It's not a pleasant screen. So it was not something that people necessarily wanted to keep doing once they've done one. The endpoint that they were studying, the bad event, was death by breast cancer over some window. So that's a bad event which we had to define. And so again, the absolute risk reduction is now just going to be the difference in the rate of cancer deaths in the treatment group versus the rate of deaths in the control group. And the relative risk reduction that I hinted at on the previous slide is the percentage decrease of risk in the treatment group versus the control group. So we can just nicely sum things up. Now we're looking at rates of death in both groups. The absolute risk reduction is the difference. The relative risk reduction is you take the absolute risk reduction and normalize it by the rate in the control group. So these are the things that we can compare them on. And now we can actually look at what did they see when they did their study. So they enrolled up to 1963, followed everyone for 5 years. This is what we saw. First of all, the number of cancer deaths, again, breast cancer deaths, there were 39 in the treatment group, 63 in the control group. So the first takeaway is just like with paralysis from polio, breast cancer is rare. It's devastating, and many of us, I'm sure everybody here knows someone affected, and yet it's actually a very rare occurring event. Even in women, these are women 45 to 65, right? So it's not. So it's interestingly not super common, which is great. The overall mortality, just people dying of other causes, is much higher, as you might imagine. There's lots of things out there that will unfortunately get us. And so while there's 0.2% of the control group died of breast cancer, 3% died of just some other causes. So in terms of reducing all kinds of death, mammography didn't have a significant reduction. So here we have the estimates of the average, the absolute risk reduction and the relative risk reduction. And these are the confidence intervals I told you about, and the confidence intervals both contain 0. And so we would reject that those are significant reductions, even though we saw some. So, but cancer death risk reduction is a different story. In this case, because cancer death is rare, that's a very small number, but the relative risk reduction is about 38%, which is, over the course of 5 years, something you might want to think about. If I told you, of course, this is a weird thing, and we'll come back to this at the end. If I told you that I could reduce your risk of a particular form of death by 40%, would you take my treatment? It's a weird thing. It's a weird thing to ask, but we can come back to that. Now, there's another way to look at this, which this was not done by, this was not done in their study, but is a kind of modern way that people start to look at interventions like this. Is how many women needed to be screened to avoid one cancer death? And you can all check for yourselves that if you want to figure that out, you just take this ARR and invert it. It's 1 divided by the absolute risk reduction. So in this case, 1,300 women had to be screened in order to prevent one cancer death in 5 years. So you're going to hope that the screen that everyone is being recommended doesn't have bad outcomes just by itself, right? It better be the case that it's a harmless intervention if we need to treat 1,300 people to prevent one death. All right, so one of the interesting things about the clinical trial and evidence in medicine is it's supposed to be that you do the trial to decide whether or not you're going to do the treatment. But Strax opened up a mammography center in 1968, right, which was 3 years before the first check-in of the trial. He did not wait to see the answer before he started really pushing mammography. I find that to be, I think this is always true of all scientists. It's like sometimes we believe things and don't necessarily, we don't necessarily wait for the evidence to convince ourselves that something is right. That's fine. After the trial, 1 year after the trial, he published this book that I showed you the cover of, that breast cancer is curable. I'm not sure that we looked at that previous slide and that would have been the takeaway, but got to somehow get people to buy the book. So you go with the as everyone knows when they're writing their papers, sometimes you over-exaggerate in the title. Still, even by 1986, which is substantially later, only 15% of women were getting mammograms. At this point, there had been so many follow-ups from the New York trial. They accumulated 18 years or so of data, and they started to really push hard inside the American Cancer Society. And so because of a strong push, they got this number up to 70% of all women by 1999. It really became a very, very common standard of care in the United States. And I think elsewhere as well. I've just mostly been looking at the United States. But does mammography cure breast cancer? I mean, the book said it did. Yes, sir.
Okay, two things. So one is, what did he write in the book?
What's
the actual randomized trial was just 100 pages of I believe this might work, or yet?
Well, he wrote the book. He wrote the book 1 year later. So the book, they had the trial results.
Okay,
I think for the most part, the book is interesting because he's trying to just destigmatize. First of all, destigmatize breast cancer, because at the time, the popular knowledge of what caused cancer or what caused breast cancer was very, was incredibly thin. So women thought often that aggressive sex might cause breast cancer. That was like a conventional wisdom. And this book tries to set out a lot of things as saying none of that's true, it's not your fault, all this kind of thing. It also was trying to encourage home lump exams, and it was also trying to encourage mammography. So it was much more of a book for everybody to read, to understand, to kind of destigmatize both breast cancer and breast cancer screening. And that's mostly what's in the book. And then he had one chapter about their clinical trial that shows that cancer is curable.
And then the moment they start to have 70% of the women doing it, did anybody try to some of the back testing, randomized, controlled trial where you're just like?
This is where Goetze and Olsen enter. Yes, exactly. The question is, does this actually work? Does it, can we actually, like Lorenzo was saying, we trust one trial? Maybe not. So Goetze and Olsen tried to do, Goetze and Olsen are famous for a meta-analysis of mammography trials. They gathered a bunch of trials that had been done in the interim between the initial New York trial and 2000, and really tried to suss out, is there an overall benefit here? Their first concern was, their claims that these people were assigned at random. Is that true? It turns, if you look at the trial reports, there are lots of different numbers. I showed you 31,000, very clean number. But if you look at the trial reports, that number varied between 30,000 and 32,000, and the precision at which that number is given is changing. So it's not really clear that it was as diligent as maybe you might have hoped. And the second question is, were people who already had been diagnosed with breast cancer properly excluded from the trial? It was not clear that those in the control group, because they never actually had the mammogram, were not excluded for having breast cancer upon entering. And again, since breast cancer is rare, right? We only saw in that initial 5-year follow-up 90 cases out of 60,000. Small little changes in how you're ascertaining these things can completely change the result, because we're talking about dozens of cases. And if you're screening and rejecting, in this case, hundreds of cases, hundreds of women are being excluded. Now that number is so much larger that these kind of ambiguities may actually influence your estimates. And the last one, and this is not something I appreciated until I started doing this project, is a death, for most of us here, some of us are spiritual, is an unambiguous event. Maybe when exactly it occurs is ambiguous, but when a person is in the ground, unfortunately, sadly, it's a very bias-resistant observation. What about cancer death? Cancer death is actually much, much trickier, because that is a causal attribution, that the death was because of cancer. So for example, I'll give you one, my father, I should maybe disclose this earlier, my father is an oncologist. So actually, I knew a little, this is also partially maybe why I got into this. My father's an oncologist, and he asked me, and he's had this problem in his studies, if a patient who has cancer, terminal cancer, commits suicide, is that a cancer death? I don't know. I I don't know. I don't know. So I think it's interesting that these kinds of things are, or another case that we had recently, maybe that really relates to all of us, if someone who has terminal cancer and is in hospice catches COVID and dies, is that a COVID death or a cancer death? Okay, I don't know. So anyway, so we have an issue here that actually how you adjudicate cause of death is sensitive, so that it becomes an issue here. And when Gershon and Olson put together all of the studies that had been done before, up to that point, and tried to adjudicate which ones follow protocols that would be, that would match the 3 standards that they have in the previous slide, they found there were only 2 that actually had proper randomization, blinded screening of whether or not someone had died of cancer, and proper reporting of the numbers of enrolled patients. And in that case, now the result is very, very ambiguous as to whether or not breast cancer screening reduces breast cancer deaths. What you see here is the relative risk reduction on the x-axis. This is the 0 point, which means nothing is happening. And we had 2 that straddled the line. The ones that were a little bit more ambiguous were painting a slightly different picture. And now we have this weird thing of how do we actually incorporate evidence from these trials? These trials are problematic. These trials maybe aren't. How do we actually weight the full body of evidence here? It's tricky. It's tricky. So where are we now? What's the current state? At least, okay, maybe this is changing. I think this is changing rapidly, and I would love to hear from the women in the audience if they still think this is true. But in surveys that were done over the past, at least somewhat recently, the perception of mammography was still positive, that it was an important thing to do. In the study, they would ask women how many people, if there are 1,000 women, how much did they anticipate breast cancer screening helped? They both assumed that more women died of breast cancer than not, and that the reduction was about a 2-fold reduction of relative risk with or without screening. That it was the relative risk reduction was a factor of 2, even though we only saw 40% in the initial trial. Actually, let me just speak to the second one. The actuality is that breast cancer is much more rare than people anticipate, and the risk reduction is much smaller. So we're saving maybe 1 person from without screening to with screening, rather than 1 person out of 1,000 rather than 80 out of 1,000. And indeed, the problems of the things that are stacked up is that for every death that's prevented, thousands of women receive a screening. There are mammography, unfortunately, has very high false positive rate, and those lead to a lot of unnecessary biopsies, and even worse, lead to unnecessary treatments, including mastectomies. So it's for every death prevented, we may have 3 to 14 unnecessary procedures, radiation, chemotherapy, mastectomies, and that would become a bit of an ethical concern whether or not we recommend it to everyone. There are lots of reasons why this has happened. I think one thing that definitely happened since the 60s is our treatments have improved. So the operable threshold went from low to much higher, and now you have a lot more time to act post symptoms. So that's one thing that is a good benefit of advances in medical technology. And our understanding of cancer has grown. I think one of the biggest problems with breast cancer prediction is that you can't tell the difference on a mammogram between a cancer that will grow really, really slowly and never hurt you. Or you'll never notice. You'll die, you'll have cancerous parts of your body, but something else will get you at 103. Whatever. We all, sadly, the only thing I'm sure of here is we're all going to die eventually. You can't tell the difference between one that you can operate on, and between one that might metastasize so rapidly that there's nothing you can do. They all look the same on X-ray. And that's another huge issue, which kind of, I think, starts to mitigate why it wasn't that useful in the intervention. So in the United States, at least, we are getting a little bit more conservative about cancer screening. I found this to be one of the more fascinating changes in medicine over my adult lifetime. We went from being aggressively, preventative medicine was as front and center in the late 90s into the 2000s, and we backed off. I talked about breast cancer, which does have this fascinating history of being early. Prostate cancer is much, much worse. the false positive rates of prostate cancer exams were so high that they now don't even recommend you do them. And what we're seeing is that cancer death rates, this is all positive, have been decreasing since 2000, despite screening less. So that's also amazing. So despite turning to screen less people are dying of cancer. Again, treatments have improved. Wait.
So those numbers are for these three kinds of cancers, or so?
This is all cancer. This is all cancer. I just included three. I didn't want to make a table to show. I could have. All the screenings and how they've changed. The other thing that's interesting is I think everybody knows is the United States is crazy about our healthcare system is crazy. I don't know how much everybody knows about it. First of all, that it's really hard to get. You have to get it through. Most people get only the best kind through their employer. So people who are poor are incredibly undertreated, and people who are rich, you would think get good healthcare, but they actually are overtreated. So everything's a little messed up over there. So I think things were actually always a little less aggressive and crazy in Europe, but I live where I live, so I'm telling you my own story. Speaking of Europe, one thing that's interesting is the only screening that seemed to get more aggressive from the 90s to today was colon cancer. Especially in the United States, the recommendation from the American Cancer Society is dropped very recently. So it's impacted me. That's coming up for me. They dropped the screening, the first annual screening time for a colonoscopy from 50 to 45. Now, do colonoscopies prevent colon cancer? Well, just last year, this wonderful trial in Europe came out trying to answer that question. It turned out that no one had ever even done a randomized trial of colonoscopy, which is absolutely wild. That was just something that we just went with. The US loves it because you can charge $2,000 per visit, cash, and we do it fairly aggressively. A consortium of physicians in Europe, a lot of Nordic countries and Poland and a couple other places, tried to do a screening to understand whether or not colon cancer could be prevented by using colonoscopy. So in this case, we're going to see we have the same kind, it was structured the same kind of way that the HIP trial was structured. The enrollment started in 2009 and ended in 2014. You have the same kind of split. Here we actually have more people being given usual care than offered colonoscopy. The treatment, again, was being offered a colonoscopy screening, not actually taking one. Okay, so we had a 42% acceptance rate, and the primary endpoint was colorectal cancer and death. They had two primary endpoints. I just want to put up again for the HIP trial. These look very similar. You have a long screening period. You have a huge body of people being offered them. The treatment is, again, offering the screen. The percentage of acceptance was, in that, not perfect, but a reasonable amount. And again, they're looking at cancer mortality. And what did Nordic find? It again found that colon cancer is much more rare than we think. 0.3% of people in the control group in this case died of colon cancer, but 11% died of something else. This is older people. So this is an older cohort, and it is a little bit depressing that you're in that 50 to 65 range. Your odds of making it through the end is about 10%. I guess smaller the longer we go. Sorry, I'm going to bring it up at the end, I promise. Talk about cancer. The cancer death reduction was actually strikingly bad. Actually, there was no significant reduction in cancer deaths at all. And it's amazing because everybody, again, they just switched the recommendation from 50 to 45, and it doesn't do anything. And indeed, the number, if you just take the point estimate of 0.03% of the risk reduction, which was not significant, then the number you need to treat is somewhere between 1,000 and infinity to prevent one death. So interesting. Okay. So what are those takeaways from cancer screening? It was an intervention that people got really excited about and really behind, but the evidence is very, very slim as to whether or not it helps. And I think there are lots of lessons for us in machine learning that we're seeing here. Also, let me ask Lorenzo. So we started a little late, but you want me to stop? I will stop at 5. Should I stop at 5? Okay. So then I'm just going to go quickly over these, and I want to tell you one other idea. Okay. So the main lessons for machine learning here are, 1, labels really matter, right? As we said, cancer death is a very murky phenomenon, and it's a causal attribute. We have very rare events that could really tilt the balance, and maybe we're seeing something that's not there. We know that's true in machine learning as well, that certain labels are reliable and certain aren't. And it's a big deal in prediction problems to really believe that what you're predicting is real. The second thing, and again, something probably what got me doing this work in the first place, is machine learning models are very sensitive to changes in population, and the results of our trials seem to have the same kind of properties that machine learning models have as well. As we saw that, people, one thing I didn't mention, which probably could explain a lot of that decrease in slope, is people also stopped smoking. A lot of diets changed. Cancer therapies got better, and so the results that we saw in 1963 might not be the same. They might not be stable enough to be present. And I think the last one is the really hard one. It's just because you offer someone a mammogram, which is what we were studying the effect of, doesn't really give you a full downstream, and you could predict what happens from offering a mammogram to an outcome. It doesn't really describe that interim of all the different processes that you went through to actually treat. It doesn't tell you what part is helping and how to titrate. So, good. I really quickly want to kind of just give you a different perspective of some things I've been thinking about. Because I got super deep into medical literature. I got super depressed after reading about too many cancer is a depressing thing to read about, first of all. But also just to understand how evidence is really tricky. I want to do something crazy where I jump really quick. Oh no. I had all these animations and I'm going to skip them. I just want to kind of go to this one last point, and something I've been thinking about, and something that I think is actually really maybe worth pursuing a little bit more broadly. The question is, what does a randomized trial tell me about me? If I read something in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it tells me that the risk reduction of some treatment is 50%, what does that tell me about me? It doesn't tell me anything. It doesn't tell me anything. Right? I'm going to have to make some mental leaps about whatever happened in this trial to how it affects me. I could very well be if I have one of these trials, it doesn't tell me that I personally have a 20% risk of a bad event without treatment. It says that, if you have 100 people, there are 20 people that will have a bad event. 10 of these will not have a bad event. It doesn't tell you which I think is really, and you don't know which one you're in. And I think the important thing for cancer screening trials is they're telling us what should the American Cancer Society recommend for a population. But they can't say anything about what they should recommend to you. And so one of the things I've been thinking about, and I don't have time to tell you what we've been doing, unless you want to hang out for a drink or two, because then I have plenty of time, is it possible that we could take these ideas of interventions and apply them to individuals? So rather than trying to say that we have trials only for populations to understand population recommendations, is there a way of thinking about how you can do a trial for you? To figure out maybe what you should do. Right? Is a trial even the right idea to think about what I should do to make myself, whatever, to improve some condition, or just to make myself feel better when I get out of bed in the morning? And when we think, I'm not sure if the right way to think about that is, again, as improvement. Because again, what trials tend to do is try to find the thing that improves a population outcome. If I think about it as improving my own outcome, does that just mean I'm just going to run an optimization problem on myself? And is that even possible? I think the answer is yes. And I'd be happy to explain some of the ideas there that are not all mine, that there is a little subgroup of physicians who agree with me. And I think that's actually a really fascinating place of future research, taking this broader population view and starting to think, what can we actually say and do with individuals? And with that, I'll stop. I'd be happy to take some questions. I think we're promised more ChatGPT from Lorenzo. No. Anyway, but thanks again for coming, and yes, I'm happy to answer.